Thanks for choosing this free Anfield Index podcast. If you'd prefer to listen to this or any of our other shows without adverts, then now's the time to check out Anfield Index Pro. With AI Pro, you can supercharge your entire listening experience. You'll not only get all of our podcasts without the ads, but you'll have them far faster with our Quick Publish feature available exclusively for subscribers. AI Pro also puts you in the heart of our sound studio, with an option to listen to many of our shows live and interact with the podcasters in real time as the shows are recording. Upgrading couldn't be easier. AI Pro is available on all popular podcast platforms, and we have our own apps for Apple and Android. Just head on over to AnfieldIndexPro.com and get started today.
Hello and welcome to the Minefield podcast from Anfield Index Pro. As always, I am your host, Alan O'Donoghue, and I am joined by my co-conspirator, Mr. Andrew Vincent. Andrew, how are you doing today?
Well, I got a promotion to co-conspirator, so actually I'm feeling pretty good. Good. And I didn't call you doctor today. I thought we'd, make it a bit more informal today. I don't have a doctorate in conspiracy, so conspiring. So that's fair. Good to keep my credentials for psychology where they actually belong. And I don't have any credentials today, which is actually sort of freeing. We got someone with all the credentials.
We do. This is a really special episode for us, and we're absolutely delighted to have Jose Pelayo from the Atlantic Council, which is a Washington-based think tank. And today what we're going to talk about is the ethics of the World Cup, and we might just touch on the ethics of FIFA in general. But Jose, how are you doing today?
Pretty good. Thanks so much, Andrew and Alan, for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, we're delighted to have you. And when we were actually throwing around ideas for this podcast, we were looking at, we hear bits and pieces about, since Qatar won the right to host the World Cup, about a lot of the challenges that have gone on, some of the ethical issues that have taken place, and some of the questions. But we didn't feel that we were necessarily positioned with enough information to make the relevant arguments either side. So we thought we'd go and find somebody who probably knows quite a bit more than us, and we've landed with you, and we're delighted to have you here. So I suppose, do you want to just give people a bit more of an idea of your background and where you have kind of built your credentials from, seeing as Andrew was talking about credentials?
Sure, yes. Thanks again. So I've been at the Atlantic Council, which is a Washington-based think tank, for the past 2 years. I work at the Middle East program, so we look at the Gulf, at the Arab states of the Gulf very closely, including Qatar, of course. And I mostly focus on the security side. So the Scowcroft Security Initiative, which is looking at the U.S. security cooperation with the Gulf states. But then in terms of Qatar, me and my colleague Hamid, which is my ex-colleague, since he moved to the Department of Defense, we started researching this piece because we wanted to look at after Russia was suspended, we wanted to look at the implications for the World Cup in Qatar. And of course, there was a lot of, buzz around when the World Cup was awarded, calls for boycott, and all of that. So we researched for about 3 months, I would say, and then we put together this piece, which I think came out pretty comprehensive to an extent. Looking at the geopolitics and the ethical side of it, as well as we're probably going to face a very political World Cup. In terms of my background, I've traveled in the region. I lived in the region for a couple of years as a teenager, and also I worked in the region in the past. So, I would say, I think this is not many people here in DC are covering the Qatar World Cup, especially in terms of the think tank space. So they haven't much. So, I was very excited to work on this piece.
Yeah, and I suppose this is where we did connect with you, was around the piece that you wrote, and it was fascinating to read. And for me, reading it, it actually got me to reframe my perspective, even just in terms of FIFA getting involved in the geopolitical side of things. But I suppose for our listeners, do you want to give them a basic overview of what the article consisted of and where they can go and actually look for it?
Sure. Yeah, so the article is up on our AtlanticCouncil.org. There it will be, let me just go back to the piece. Can soccer plead ignorance? So that's the name of the article. Can soccer plead ignorance? A World Cup of politics is brewing for Qatar. I think the piece first starts looking at the history of suspending countries from the tournament in the past, and now that the topic comes again to the spotlight because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, FIFA, after pressure, of course, from other national federations and clubs, they decided to suspend Russia. And I think we're looking at, okay, this is probably, there are probably going to be a lot of demonstrations at the World Cup in support of Ukraine, perhaps, and a lot of other demonstrations for perhaps the LGBTQ community or journalists or any other community that perhaps might feel that not so secure going to Qatar given some of the restrictions. And then basically we look at the history and then we move to Russia, and then what does that mean for Qatar, but also what does that mean for Qatar's integration with its neighbors, which, the relations haven't been so stable in the past. Kind of looking not only at the negative side of the tournament happening in Qatar, but also the positive side, which could be, an improvement of human rights. It could be it could highlight the role of the increasing role of women in playing sports in the Gulf. So I think that's very important. Besides calling for boycott, which I think might be the easy way out, I think actually going and perhaps fighting for what you believe on the field and in the country, I think might lead to more than just boycotting. And yeah, I think we basically, close the article by saying that this is the first Arab country and the Muslim country to ever host a World Cup. And two things can be true. I think, Qatar obviously has a history of abusing migrant workers and a history also of, not being able to guarantee human rights for its migrant workers. But at the same time, we also have to look at the coverage. Perhaps it has been a bit biased, perhaps sometimes based on double standards, because I do not remember much of this happening when it was Russia, even though the record of Russia, also in human rights, is pretty horrible. So yeah, I think, they're looking, instead of calling for boycott, they could position themselves and be like, oh, the World Cup is, it's going to put Qatar in the spotlight. So why don't we use this as an opportunity to advocate for what we believe is right, in this case, human rights. So.
Yeah, and you've brought up a number of really important topics there that we want to kind of delve into with you, because that's essentially where myself and Andrew wanted to kind of come to, was trying to be a bit more balanced and not just go with a particular narrative in a way that, can disregard so many other sides to this and the potential for it. And Andrew, please feel free to jump in terms of the conversations we've been having. But I suppose the very first, for me personally, finding out that the Qatar was getting the World Cup, it seemed a bit odd, right? Just from the perspective of the lack of history, the lack of actual stadiums, so getting, and the fact that it would have to be moved, that the football season would have to be moved, it seemed quite odd. But at the same time, I also thought Brazil getting the World Cup was quite odd as well, because of the poverty levels, and although they have a tradition of football, it was clear that, can they afford to run this, because that can be very challenging as well. So that was my initial. And then I suppose I would have known people who'd have gone out and were involved in the construction of the stadia, and was hearing back from them, and also media reports of some of the ways that the migrant workers were being treated, and what we were led to believe was it was just a conveyor belt, and if someone fell off the conveyor belt, somebody else just took their place, and we just kept going and that. Was that similar, Andrew, to what you had heard when over in the States?
Yeah, I mean, I think here, often we also have a human rights team within our Middle East programs, and this is something that they often discuss. It's like, several reports by Human Rights Watch, for example, they've indicated that migrant workers, I think last year, they interviewed a couple of embassies of countries that send migrant workers, such as Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and I think they were able to confirm at least 6,700 deaths from migrant workers. And this was based on a interview conducted by The Guardian. So, and I think, this figure didn't even include the other countries that send migrants to Qatar, like Kenya or Ghana or the Philippines. I think only India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka were included in this outreach that The Guardian did. And I think this is when you have to remember, this is when labor rights come in, and this is when you have to remember the kafala system, which basically ties the migrant worker to their employer. And I mean, I don't remember any case, even, I lived in Lebanon in the past, and the kafala system always leads to abuse, and it grants an amazing amount of power and control to employers. Even recruitment fees, some of these migrant workers have to pay, which ends up being kind of a debt that they owe to their employer. Even though, like, recently, we can say that Qatar has applied several reforms, such as now they have a minimum wage, now they allow job mobility, because before, that's it, you were tied to an employer, you couldn't change jobs. They finally removed the exit permit requirement, so you also needed a permit. Sometimes their passports were taken, so they were basically, it was like slavery to an extent. So, but these reforms did happen. But now that we look back, those reforms perhaps came a bit too late, because they do little in addressing the deaths of those migrants in the past, or the migrants deaths that already happened. So I think now there are discussions of compensation to their families, and I think the enforcement of this is sometimes uneven. And I think the biggest challenge that's happening with the compensation process, that FIFA now has commitments to under its own statutes that countries comply with human rights, and now families have the chance to reach out to the state and FIFA for cases of compensation. However, most of the migrants' deaths in the past, they were attributed to natural causes, and they were not put on the under the category of work-related. So under Qatar's law, families can get compensation if it was a natural cause death. So this is where the challenge is at the moment. So we have reforms, but then reforms perhaps came a bit too late, which is progress. It's good, but now where do we stand in terms of compensation? This is where the next kind of push should go towards. So compensation for the families of migrants that already died. So,
Jose, something that was new to me when I was doing a little bit of research for this podcast was just understanding, like you're talking about the kafala system and like kind of the larger context of like abuses of migrant workers predating the World Cup and these projects. And that was, I heard so much about it in relation to World Cup related projects, because of course that's what turned the spotlight to Qatar for me. Can you speak to that at all? Just like, I think maybe for a lot of people, they're thinking, oh, well, like these deaths are this abuse of migrant workers is related to the World Cup. This is because of the World Cup, but it seems like maybe there's a larger context for this, and the World Cup exacerbates this issue.
Yeah, no, I think, I'm not an expert in the kafala system, but the kafala system is basically a sponsorship program that allows employers to bring migrant workers to the country. And employers have a lot of power. There are even recruitment agencies back in India, back in Nepal, back in Pakistan. And I think from where I see it, and I've seen horrible abuse of the kafala system, domestic abuse, even against some of these migrant workers. For example, in the case of Lebanon, they used to take away their passports, domestic abuse, lock them up, they wouldn't let them leave the country. It's a pretty horrible system in general. So, and it's not specifically related to the World Cup. I think this comes from before. But now, I think a positive side is that the World Cup now brought these changes. So now they don't need the exit permit requirement. Now they can change jobs if they don't like their employer. So that's the bright side here, which I appreciate.
Mm-hmm. You talked before, like kind of in the intro, about a little bit of a double standard in attending to these like human rights abuses, especially for migrant workers, and maybe like comparing it specifically to Russia. Like, could you say a little bit more about that? That was interesting to me, and something I hadn't heard about with Russia, but I'm sure partly because of the biases, maybe it wasn't attended to in the same way.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think, we have to recognize that the backlash against Qatar has been much louder, I think, than the one against Russia, which makes you wonder if there's some kind of bias involved here, because Qatar is an Arab country and also an Islamic country. And I think, as I mentioned before, both things can be true. Qatar has a history of treating migrants very poorly, by not complying with basic human rights. And also you have, on top of that, the corruption, of the claims around corruption and bribery that happened when the tournament was awarded. But I do see sometimes on the headlines that it's time to boycott the World Cup. I don't remember seeing those with Russia. Again, so for me, they just sometimes sound a bit orientalistic and Islamophobic. Often comes to the point of questioning an Arab country's capabilities to host such an event, right? Instead of focusing how can the country improve its record and conditions based on this tournament. So I do believe the World Cup offers many opportunities. I'm not sure how well Russia used this opportunity. I don't think they did. But especially on the coverage of human rights, which, as you saw, pushed the country to implement reforms. And I think hopefully this will be a continuous trend overall in the country, just to speed up domestic reforms, but also continue to improve working conditions for migrant workers. And I think that this is where the World Cup can be a catalyst, as long as Qatar takes this opportunity. So there's that condition. The World Cups are already a huge incentive for countries. So, that put together with reforms to bring really a lot of change and, social political change. Like I mentioned also, the role of women in sports and the golf is something that's increasing. So I think this...
Are you that person who has everything? The coolest merch and those must-have fan threads? Well, over at our Anfield Index shop, we've gone that extra mile when it comes to pimping up your Liverpool collection. From our popular range of bespoke design t-shirts, sweaters, hoodies and hats, to our signature edition mugs, prints and coasters, all provided with fast worldwide shipping. We have something for every red. We also stock official LFC merchandise and are licensed with the Premier League and UEFA to sell official iron-on shirt badges and sleeve patches. As a listener to this podcast, you can get 10% off everything with coupon code AIPRO10. Just head over to AnfieldIndex.shop or find us on Etsy by searching for Anfield Index.
The World Cup being in an Arab country and an Islamic country can definitely bring another perspective into the global sports media and culture, which is normally what we see is the usual Euro-Western lens that is represented. So I think that's healthy, and I think that's good just for many people to overcome their biases. And if it comes with improvements on human rights and working conditions, that's even better. So yeah.
I suppose, what's come to me is I can absolutely see what you're saying, and in some ways it's disappointing, I could imagine, for the Arab nations for the first World Cup being hosted there, having such a cloud over it. And I'm sure many people would say if we had have had it in somewhere else where maybe there wouldn't be the same challenges, but it is what it is and we have to deal with it. And there may be arguments from people to say, well, surely these countries, or Qatar certainly, shouldn't need a World Cup coming to change their way of working, or to have had whatever thousand, like that number is immense. That's a huge amount of people that are dead. Like, they're actual human beings who are no longer on this planet because of the system that was there. And personally, for me, I find it challenging to go and celebrate a World Cup knowing that this has happened. But then at the same time, I see that for the region, this could have long-lasting positive impact. But what do you say to those who would maybe question, well, why does it take a World Cup to make this type of change?
I think that's a great question. And I think perhaps, obviously, the responsibility is with the country, but also I think you have to look at FIFA. I think, before they awarded the tournament, they did perhaps little due diligence in regards to human rights and protections for migrant workers. And I think now, I believe it was in 2016 when they decided that, countries have to disclose their human rights risk and mitigation strategies. I think that was a bit too late. So it wasn't until the countries that were selected for the 2026 World Cup where human rights were taken into consideration. So I think, in terms of Qatar and Russia, given this, they didn't go under much scrutiny under FIFA. So, because certainly the filters were not in place. No conditions were set for journalists, fans, even athletes. So, even despite all we know from countries like Russia and China using sports to sport watch the record. But then now that, I have little confidence in FIFA ever since Russia. So, but I think the question comes now, is it ethical to continue having the World Cup in Qatar? And I think, it's unlikely that perhaps, that FIFA is going to cancel the tournament. So I think the best we can do as society is just use this opportunity to advocate for what we believe is right, for ethical standards, instead of now, kind of reacting. I think we should use this opportunity, which is huge. The spotlight that's placed on the country, I think it comes once. So I think that's where I see myself now. Like, okay, it's too late for the World Cup to be canceled or to be moved to a different country, like it's happening in a couple months. So use this opportunity just to advocate for what you believe is right, which I think takes more work than boycotting. So boycotts can be certainly useful. Again, I'm not saying they're not, because if it wasn't for boycotts, then FIFA would have suspended Russia probably. So, but I think the pressure that's going to come from the fans and from the clubs during the World Cup, that's going to be heavy on the country. For example, I think it's the Danish lottery. They decided they were giving away the space on the gear of the players just to have phrases in favor of human rights for migrant workers, which I think is a great idea. And I hope other companies do the same. So I think this is where our job is now.
Yeah, so it's about, we are where we are, and it's about what can we do to use the platform to look to make change, not only in Qatar, but in, probably many countries across the world. And
Correct.
I do think, and it's really important, it's very easy, and I'm sure FIFA would not be disappointed if all the talk was about Qatar and all the talk was about Russia, because what it does is it takes the view off of them and their responsibility as an organisation. And let's be honest, would anyone with any interest in football turn around and say that FIFA clearly is an ethically run organisation? I personally, I only speak for myself, but I'd be very surprised if most people would say yes, they are ethical, and that there is no no dealings going on that maybe shouldn't be going on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm there with you. So I think, FIFA has a history, and yeah, the history, I think those are facts. So it has been problematic. Mm-hmm. So,
Andrew, from your perspective, you can jump in now. What's your view of FIFA and their responsibility?
I think the responsibility question is one like I have for Josie too, is just to think of like, we talk sometimes, I think about the responsibility of the fans, and we're talking about the responsibility of Qatar, but we haven't really talked about what's the responsibility of FIFA yet, and like what realistic changes have been made there to improve this process. And so, Josie, you mentioned that human rights is now like part of the vetting process for deciding on a World Cup. Could you speak a little bit more, to that part of things? And then I have I'll ask the follow-up when it's a follow-up instead of an initial question.
Sure. Yeah. So, this was something that I found out when I was doing my research for the piece that I wrote. And I think it wasn't until 2016, so much after the Russia and the Qatar World Cup were awarded, that they announced that human rights will be part of the consultation and bid process phases for the selection of the 2026 countries. So now for the 2026 process, or from 2016 on, countries had to disclose any risk regarding human rights, but not only the risk, but also what are you going to do to fix that, or mitigation strategies, in other words. Which, again, I'm surprised this wasn't there before. Like it wasn't part of the status of FIFA in the past. So it was after, and I imagine this came during just 2 years prior the Russia World Cup, because I did see some calls for boycott against Russia, I believe from Poland or so some of the countries in Eastern Europe, which makes a lot of sense given what's happening today. So, but yeah, I mean, I think FIFA has a huge responsibility, and I think now, there should be pressure to follow up with the families of migrant workers to make sure that their commitments under this new status of human rights is followed by the proper processing of compensations for their families of the workers. So that's a remedy that I could see going forward, and that society and fans can push for.
So one of the other things, like, I was curious about, like, kind of talking about mitigation strategies, maybe not so much at the FIFA level, but like for Qatar and some of these changes, these policy changes, to what extent are these performative, or, the spotlight is here now, and so we'll implement these changes, and then the spotlight goes away and these changes go away. Is that, like, I would be curious about that, because like I like this argument of, like, by all means, like, let's be present with the World Cup. Maybe celebrate is a strong word for it, but like, we engage with this World Cup. We also engage politically. That leads to change in positive ways. But then, if those changes are like temporary and a little bit of a show, then that seems like a nice excuse for me to watch the World Cup comfortably and then move on.
Right. I mean, yeah, you have a great point. And I think this is when, compensation or other, mitigation strategies post the events have already happened. Because in Qatar, most of what we're talking in terms of human rights violations, they happened before. They still happening, of course. But I think the enforcement part, which is something that you brought up, is something that, FIFA, but also the international community, other organizations such as Human Rights Watch or Amnesty should keep a close eye on. After the World Cup is done, are they following up with their commitments? And it's interesting that you mentioned the performative part. I think just the process of how these reforms were implemented, they have to go. I think at first they were proposed and they didn't pass the Shura Council, which is kind of their National Assembly. So the second time they did pass. So it was kind of a process of approving these reforms was kind of, you have some representation or representative. So it was kind of, let's say, plural in this context. But I mean, Qatar is also a country that's very smart with their foreign policy. So that's something that I think the international community has to keep a close eye on in terms of enforcement and their commitments. They're just them following up with their reforms. So,
and I found it interesting as well. You're talking about how what FIFA have implemented in terms of moving forward. But when you were doing your research, did you come across how FIFA plan on implementing it? So, what if they award to a country like they've done, and the country say, this is how we're going to mitigate, this is how we're going to mitigate, this is how we're going to mitigate, but don't actually mitigate? Like, is it within FIFA's, I won't say power, but because it's within their power, but is it realistic that they would pull the plug on a World Cup that could be 6 months, a year away?
Yeah, I think, here you also have FIFA, but you also have other multinational corporations that have already invested money, perhaps, that are very unlikely to pull out. Like now, I think you don't see any major, at least corporations. I think mostly European ones are boycotting the conference. But yeah, I honestly, it's an interesting question, especially given the questions of money and bribery. It's an interesting question, and I think it needs a follow-up research in terms of how they're looking at their the mitigation strategies. Like, if they don't actually do it, then what will FIFA do? And I think this is when it's time for them to like kind of set their standards and set a set of policies that deals with this in particular, especially after this year with Russia. So I think it's time for them now to have this kind of governance in place that they actually follow. That would be very important. So, but yeah, I think at this point, I think most of the corporations that are boycotting the World Cup seem to be in Europe. I know I think ING, which is a big financial institution in the Netherlands and also in Belgium. I think they're also, they're not taking the allocations of tickets or participating in any promotion. So, but I think that deserves a follow-up research in terms of how will they do it now if they don't have the necessary governance framework to actually move, or perhaps an alternative country, because I know alternative countries were discussed for Qatar, and that was also during the time where Qatar's neighbors had some pretty significant issues happening. So just in terms of regional politics. So I saw discussions that, maybe the World Cup should be in Saudi and the UAE instead of Qatar. So I saw that. But I think this should come from FIFA, not from the countries themselves.
And you did mention the tensions within the region. Can you speak for some of those fans who maybe don't know much about those types of tensions and how the World Cup being awarded to Qatar has been used in this respect?
Yeah, definitely. That's I think it's been very interesting to watch in terms of now, after the World Cup was awarded to Qatar, then you have other countries in the region, Qatar's neighbors, also like bidding for world tournaments and other major events, because now it's like part of the culture. Like now they want to host. I think Saudi wants to hold the Winter Olympics, and they will build their own basically snow and I think neon, which is their own city. This city that they're building in the desert, which to me was very surprising. But this is where this is going. Now there's a sports culture of hosting these events. I don't think, Qatar won't be the first, because Bahrain, which is also a tiny island next to Saudi Arabia, they've been hosting the F1, the Formula One race for quite a while, and they I think I've watched some of them actually in Bahrain, not in the country but from here, and it's it's a major event for locals, so it's become part of the culture now. But I think the regional tensions come from the part that Qatar's foreign policy sometimes is very different from that of its neighbors. So they just have different goals. So that's where, and I think the rivalry just goes way back. So, but it created a lot of competition. Like, why Qatar? Why not us? So now there's a lot of bidding happening between themselves, just for other. You had the Expo also in the UAE, which, of course, I have several colleagues that went, and it was very impressive. So I think perhaps, now that I look back, I think perhaps the UAE is more developed and have more capabilities to host this event. But again, it was given to Qatar, which is, now, Qatar is using it to develop its transportation more, to develop more infrastructure, where hopefully they put it to use after the World Cup is done. So,
kind of on this subject of more Middle Eastern and Gulf countries like hosting events and bidding for events, like you talked before about sort of the exchange that can take place maybe in a positive way of like traditionally sport, or like football, soccer as a sport especially, being largely dominated by sort of South American, Western, cultures. Like, what do you think, like, the sport of soccer, or just like sort of these cultures have to gain from the exchange of ideas going the other way, beyond just looking at maybe some of the negative things that are going on here? Like, yeah, does that question make sense? I don't have like a good way to finish it, but I think
I think so. You're wondering, how does that change the perception of the kind of the Euro-Western lands towards the region? Yeah, I think that's a good question. Soccer is an incredibly popular sport in the Gulf. Like, everyone I know and I met from the Gulf is a big fan of soccer, and they're pretty obsessed. And in the Middle East too. In Egypt, it's huge. But I think this kind of sporting culture that's going to be portrayed, right, with the World Cup is, I think for many people that never heard perhaps of Qatar, they're going to see it and they're like, okay, they're also fans. They play sports, and for some people perhaps Europe is closer, so not so much, but perhaps here in the US, you might say, okay, they have a well-developed sports culture and media, because actually they also have pretty good in terms of media coverage for sports. I think they have, or they were Saudi's the one that also has very good media coverage of sports. So their own indigenous channels and media. So I think it could have a big impact on changing people's perception that never have the country just looking at, there's more stuff about the region, not only the negative things that you see. There are, they're just, I think that's going to bring them closer in terms of, they're just, they're kind of like us. Or they're just like us. They do this as well. They are soccer fans or football fans. So I think that's important. That's important. I think given the first World Cup that's ever given to an Arab country, I think it will be huge. And I hope that Qatar and other countries in the region really use this opportunity, to portray their culture, their people, which has many, many positive aspects. And I speak from experience. So.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that certainly in Europe, a lot of the talk of countries from the region, coming into typical Western sports, but I think the president for Formula One is from UAE, I think. And we have Newcastle's takeover, we have PSG, we have Man City, and it's viewed very much as this. Everything here is just about sports washing. It's just about sports washing, but there is a huge culture of sport in these regions, and I'm wondering, is there, or has there been a bit of a challenging balance for Qatar and some of the other countries to maintain their own traditions and their own values, and not feel like they have to change to become westernized, but at the same time recognizing some of the traditional things that could be changed or maybe are better for people in general in terms of human rights?
Yeah, I think there's definitely the struggle of where to find the balance, right? And I always say I'm jealous that they get to keep their traditional clothing, because I think that's one of the best things they have, and that's something that they never change. Even for formal meetings at the UN or elsewhere, they keep it. So, but in terms of human rights and just how to make them feel that they don't have to become westernized, I think for Qatar that will be a big question. As far as I know, they haven't banned perhaps drinking, which, of course, sporting events, there's a huge culture of drinking. As far as I know, they haven't banned that side of it. There was a fake picture going around as last night that was shared, not by the government, so it wasn't an official picture, but by a Twitter account it's like a conservative group within Qatar that were, no drinking, no dating, no homosexuality. But again, this wasn't an official picture. I'm sure you guys came across it. But the fact is that, the government and the actual committee of the World Cup in Qatar, they haven't banned any of those things. So I think so far they're being pretty open, and I think they will continue to be open. I don't think they're going to risk it in terms of the news getting out, or like, they arrested someone that was drinking, or etc. I just don't see it happening. It will be a huge backlash, and they're very cognizant of the media coverage on the country. So they're very cognizant of that. So.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to now kind of shift gears into us as fans and fans in general. And, like we've already kind of touched on, maybe boycotting isn't the best use of the platform that we have as fans. But certainly what I've noticed here is there is a lot of advertisements around come to the World Cup, and I've never seen this before to this level. Like, there's a huge push to try and make it, very accessible to the Europeans, essentially, and it could be the same in the US, I don't know. But do we as fans have an ethical responsibility to really understand what is happening in terms of the build-up to this World Cup, or is it okay for us to go, I'm just a football fan, I just want to enjoy the football?
That's a great question. I think the notion of sports here and politics there, that's completely, at this point, it's just naive. The suspension of Russia, it was politics creeping into sport. So I would completely disagree 100%. I think it's just impossible to separate those two. And I think you have other examples of politics that are going to creep into games themselves. So, like I was saying before, this is probably going to be the most political World Cup yet, given world events. Not only that it's the first Arab and Islamic country, but also the conflicts, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But I think our role as fans, I think, is important and can be useful. And I think the fans, even when they join forces with actual federations or national teams, is even more powerful. So I think, when FIFA suspended Russia, I think it was first Poland, Czech Republic, and Sweden that joined together to boycott their qualifying games that were in Russia. So obviously that brought a lot of pressure on FIFA, which the final result was that Russia was suspended. So I think fans have definitely a major role, and I think they shouldn't shy away from expressing themselves when the World Cup comes, even with the shirts, gear. So yeah.
I'm curious, if you could elaborate on that at all, and maybe maybe not, and that's fair enough. But what does it mean then to be a politically aware, politically engaged football fan? And if boycotting maybe isn't what you would consider to be the best use of that political power that fans have, what are some ways that fans can exercise that political power and maybe make a difference? Like you mentioned gear, you mentioned working in collaboration with federations. Are there other things that you can think of, or that you would know that maybe gives fans an outlet for the power that they do have?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of realization now that after FIFA's involvement, it was kind of rare, suspending a country. So I think there are a lot of fans now realizing that it's okay, there's definitely a link between these two, and you can't impossibly separate them, especially when you're awarding a major event that, it's youth sports, but it's taking place in a country with its own tradition, its own problems, its own issues, and its own records of human rights. So it's just hard to separate those two. I'm thinking besides gear and others, I don't remember if in Russia fans were able to use kind of signs, but I don't see how perhaps security will be able to to take those away and during the games, but also campaigns on FIFA and on Qatar in terms of compensation and for rights of minorities, which are not explicitly, I guess, protected. But I mean, the government of Qatar and their officials, they have come out and said you will be protected. Which I think at this point in time, like I say, I think now it's time for the fans and for us to use this opportunity to advocate. I mean, we're not just going to come here from the West and tell them hey, you can't have gay people in your games. You can't have minorities in your games or women. It's just difficult, and I think, of course, those minorities should be freely be able to go to the games. Absolutely. I mean, that's just when it gets really challenging. I think, the games are open to everyone, and it should be open to everyone. I mean, this is where I stand. I'm like, wow, okay, what if something happens to one of those journalists, a member of the religious minority, or a member of the LGBTQ minority? Then, Qatar is going to look really bad, right? And I just don't think they would do something like that. The backlash will be huge. So,
hello, I'm here to annoy you. I'm here to annoy you into listening to more of me and more of others on EPL Index. We don't just have the Anfield Index stuff. We've got EPL Index as well, which covers the entirety of the Premier League. And we have 3 podcasts and a whole bunch of really good writing on EPLindex.com. The podcasts are my own two-footed podcast, which is every day at 4 p.m., Monday through Friday, covering the whole league. We have A Tad Predictable, hosted by Tadiwa. You know Tadiwa, he does Anfield Index. He presents A Tad Predictable before every Premier League match week. And then Kevin DeVries and his crew on the EPL Roundtable, they're every week after the Premier League match week. So make sure you listen to everything we're doing on EPL Index and follow us there on Twitter at EPL Index. Thank you. Bye-bye.
I'm just listening, and I could imagine for the people from Qatar who, their religion is very important to them, and how the state operates. And I don't want to use the term vigilantism, but I could imagine, if I'm walking down the street in my home place and I'm seeing people drinking on the side of the road, like, how do you police that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, they haven't banned alcohol in terms of I think the hotels are still allowed to sell, from what I saw yesterday. Yeah, so alcohol hasn't been banned, but like you say, locals are going to be, I think this is where the shock of a lot of Westerners flying into the country, drinking, partying, etc. It's definitely going to be a shock for the locals, I think, for some of them. But I think, Qatar is a super sense of their citizens and residents or people that are very aware of the world, right? Interconnected with the world, so it's a very developed place. So I don't think, I think just speaking from my personal experience from the Qataris I know, I don't think they will mind at all to have others do it. Of course, they won't do it. But knowing from my experience and knowing them well, knowing several of them, I don't think they will mind at all. So, and there's no religious police in Qatar. So, like in Saudi they used to have a religious police, which is no longer. So that's also something to keep in mind.
Andrew, have you a further question there? You're looking like you're itching.
I think I got one more, and I'm not. I think one of the things that, like, I want to be mindful of as we have this conversation too is like, I feel like as we're working through this conversation, what we're working towards is like, okay, it's okay to engage with these games on an ethical level, and maybe that's a better way to exercise your power if you stay engaged and informed and, advocate for what you believe in. And I could also just imagine someone listening being like, whoa, like you've totally now maybe overlooked the thousands of people who have died, or a member of the LGBTQIA plus community who's like, come on, like, that's it, and like, I think I want to be mindful of someone who could be listening and being like, there's not an equivalence here in some ways that like, oh, this probably happened to some extent in Russia and the human rights abuses predated the World Cup, and, now there's this spotlight, so let's make the best use of it. I could imagine someone saying like, that's a soft argument and like doesn't fly with me, and I think there's too much being overlooked. Like, might you like kind of respond to that, Jose, or like think about that? This isn't necessarily my argument, but it's something that I could imagine being an argument, and like I think also should be responded to.
No, definitely. I mean, I'm fully there with you too. I mean, imagine perhaps families of workers that have died during the construction. I mean, just attending the workup would be, absolutely not. They've seen and they experience themselves what happened and what is possible given the lack of provision of some human rights. I mean, I think, I will not argue against that. I think that's totally fair. But I think both of them can be true in terms of, yes, I think, I see where some people might come from in terms of like, okay, we should just boycott and completely just not attend, just forget about it, right? And the other side, I think, which also has a role in, remaining engaged and advocating. So I think both of those sides are valid. I completely understand the other one that you mentioned, and the advocacy part. So I think both of them are important.
Yeah, and I think with anything, it's one of the things that myself and Andrew will talk about a lot on this podcast, is that things aren't binary. It's not if you're one way, then you have to be the other way. There's always that middle ground to try and make change. So, I'm from Ireland, so we had lots of challenges, with Britain, and going and killing British people that didn't solve the issue, but not being like that didn't solve the issue, and it was a combination of everything that came together to try and get us to a point where there is some sort of realization from those involved that we need to work together to change for the better of everybody. And I suppose that may be where people can use, and obviously people aren't fully entitled to do whatever they want, but maybe from this negative in terms of those that have died and some of the human rights issues, from this negative, maybe there can be a positive outcome for the region in general, which will then allow those people who are blazing the trail and have always blazed the trail for whatever minority it might be, to see that things are moving in a direction that they want them to move. Whereas, Qatar isn't just going to turn around and go, LGBT, women, whatever minority is absolutely fine here and there's no problem at all. Like, that's just not going to happen. But if it's making steps towards the right direction, maybe the World Cup can be a catalyst.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think, there are even, members of these minorities in Qatar itself. So I'm sure, they will also use this opportunity to advocate for their own rights. So I think it's a combination of factors at the end of it, which is, pressure from these fans or federations to stay engaged, perhaps through public displays, also in addition to people boycotting. So I think it's a combination of both that could put enough pressure in the country to finally improve its human rights record. And I think they have been building towards that moment. They're not quite there yet, but I think I guess it's some progress instead of no progress. But I think we should keep the pressure as fans and as a community on the country. Just of course being mindful of the cultural differences, because that also leads to question of, okay, this comes as Europeans to tell us what to do again, which they're very sensitive to, right? So that's also something to keep in mind.
Yeah, it's such a delicate balance, and I think maybe those of us, wherever we are in the world, who do feel that there needs to be changes, I think that's how we can start to do, is to have conversations with our local football associations, to put pressure on FIFA to actually use the platform that they're now going to have in Qatar to highlight the different minorities or in whatever way through the football, and use that as a platform. And I think that's something that we can all start to do, whether it is community groups or action groups, whatever it might be. That's the platform I think could be very positive. I would hope, anyway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, that's exactly where my colleague Haman and I were trying to get to. You know, it's like, okay, you need some kind of governance, you need some kind of ethical standards. These communities need to be protected because they want to feel comfortable going to the World Cup. So, you know, something needs to happen. Here are our policy recommendations, which is what we do at the Atlantic Council. So, and, you know, I know many of the governments in the region, they read our work. So I'm hoping, you know, they at least form part of the just kind of the advocacy process, and it did something, or someone that's in charge of policy read it. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Andrew, have any final words just before we kind of wrap this up, or any final questions for Josie?
Yeah, actually, so World Cup happens. What would you want to see during the World Cup that would make you sit back afterwards and be like, you know what, like this was a step forward, albeit with a lot of losses and a lot of things that we should be upset about and a lot of things that like weren't okay, but ultimately this was a World Cup that brought forward positive change? Like, what would you want to see that would sort of indicate to you like that's the case, versus like what would a World Cup look like that ultimately ends up feeling like a waste of an opportunity, or just I don't know, ultimately like ignorant or unethical, or soccer pleading ignorance to kind of steal the...
Right. No, I see where you're coming from. I think national clubs here have a role to play. I think what the Danish, the national motor is doing with the gear of the national team. I think it's a very smart decision in terms of portraying human rights messages during the games. I think I would like to see that. I would also like to see support for Ukraine, for example. So I think those messages and those political displays are important during the World Cup. Everyone is watching. So I think something like that, and also perhaps some kind of remembrance, or honoring those that died during their construction. I think that's perhaps a move that even the country could take, given all the media, all the negative media around their human rights records. So something like, hey, okay, we got to this point. I think it's time to just continue making progress towards improving your legislation for migrant workers. So, and I think, starting from the point of, I think, honoring and remembering those that die, but also putting a significant effort in the compensation part would be a significant, I think, step that for both FIFA and Qatar can take.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but
for sure. Yeah, like I think, what I'm hearing you say is like, if it's a World Cup that looks like every other World Cup in some ways, that wouldn't be good enough, and it hasn't been good enough in the past, right? Like we missed an opportunity in Russia. That's part of what we're saying. And like, I think even looking 4 years down the road to the World Cup that's going to be hosted by the United States, Mexico, and Canada, like let's not miss that opportunity either, to use these World Cups to bring about positive political change and advocate for things while we have a spotlight. And so like I think maybe this can be the start of a tradition of World Cups bringing more of a political spotlight for an exchange of ideas, and a sport bettering the places where it goes for the people who live there. That's a lofty ambition and probably a little naive, but like I think maybe that's in some ways what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it has to start somewhere, and I think the World Cups from some of these countries. Again, I think I have to repeat that Russia obviously didn't. It didn't have much of an impact in Russia, but I'm hoping for Qatar and perhaps the one here also, we can use it just to come together and also use it as a platform to advocate for what we believe is right, including human rights. And I think for the one coming to the U.S., I mean, migrant rights here is also a concern. Just our immigration system, how terrible and how negative it is on migrants. So coming from the southern border, for example. So that's also, I think we should use an opportunity to highlight some of those issues.
Yeah, I think that's super important. Like, I can think of plenty of places where the world's eyes would do the United States some good in terms of holding up a mirror to some of our own issues, especially, around racism too, I think.
Right. Absolutely.
And we don't have a perfect record with LGBTQIA issues at all.
Correct. Yeah. Especially now, I think now is the time, because I think, with all these setbacks perhaps in legislation, then I think, the World Cup will be a good opportunity just to portray those messages and hopefully have an impact somewhere.
And I think that's, Josie, you mentioned bias earlier, and I think that's something incredibly important to bring up too, is just like, it's so easy, I think, to sit here and be like, oh, look at these horrible human rights abuses going on over there, and that's about them. And it becomes very xenophobic and like, oh, that's, about Islam, and that's about the culture of Qatar and these Gulf countries, and that's about this. And, it becomes easier then to ignore what's going on at home and going on around you. And maybe that's something important too, is like, as we sort of engage in important criticisms and important critiques of where we're going, like being mindful of like turning our attention back to where we are in our own surroundings. And, not to say that these are equivalent things, certainly. And that, like, oh, we have problems, they have problems, so that all washes out. That's certainly not my point. But like the work that we have to go in terms of women's rights, LGBTQIA, racism, immigrants, labor, immigration systems, maybe that's valuable too. Well, it's definitely valuable, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. Definitely valuable. So, but I think, I think speaking perhaps from some of the Gulf countries, when they hear just perhaps countries in Europe or others just speaking from this very high place, like, hey, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong. For them, it's just like, okay, you see what you're doing wrong. And again, it doesn't mean that they cancel each other out or they're equivalent, but also, it's important also to look at ourselves. So
nobody likes the mirror being held up to them.
Yeah.
Especially in lofty positions. And I think, Josie, one of the big things that really struck me is about acknowledgement. And that's really important. And I think it is important that the deaths of these people are acknowledged, and that there is an acceptance that, mistakes have been made, and retribution needs to be not retribution, that's not the right word, but I can't think what the right word is. Recompense, maybe, to the families, compensation, yeah. And while money does not replace a human being, unfortunately, we can't bring those human beings back. And maybe the acknowledgement through the compensation is really important. But even the outward acknowledgement is so important.
Yeah, I think, from the policy perspective, I think for Qatar to own their mistakes, and to, instead of trying to just slide it under the rug, I think just coming out, admitting their mistakes. What are they going to do and what are they going to work on next? And I think, even, yes, money doesn't replace a migrant worker that might have died. However, some of these workers were like the main, bread provider for their families. Mm-hmm. So I think compensation will be of huge help just to put their feet back together.
I'd love to see pressure on sponsors to be involved in that compensation process too. Like, you don't sign up for a sponsorship out of the goodness of your heart, right? Like, that's a business proposition where, like, you stand to earn money on that. And so I think, every organization then that's earning money on the backs of these people who have died should be involved in that compensation process. And maybe as fans, that's another area where we can look to put some pressure or look to hold some people to account. Is, it's not just Qatar, it's not just FIFA, it's also everyone whose logo is showing up in relation to these games who has some ethical obligation, in addition to us as fans too. There's ethical obligations all the way down.
Absolutely. I think corporate accountability here will be a great way of looking at this in terms of compensation. Like, what are you doing? Because you also took part. And you're also benefiting off your logo being portrayed during commercials, etc. So, I think, corporate accountability here is also part of the equation. So, just without them, I don't see how a World Cup might go forward without the big corporations that are always involved. The usual 3 or 4 that are always involved. So,
well, Andrew, I think I speak on behalf of both of us to say a massive, massive thank you to Jose. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and something, personally for me, it's even more than I'd hoped in terms of where we would get to take this. Your knowledge and your understanding of so many of the topics that we want to discuss has been perfect for us. So thank you so much for joining us on the Anfield Index Pro Minefield podcast.
Yeah, I definitely just want to echo that too. I think Al was trying to close and speak for both of us, but I always have something to say. So your perspective, Josie, really opened up my eyes to some different ways of looking at it, and it's got me thinking a bunch. And just appreciate your taking the time a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And, thanks again for having me. And let's hope that now that the World Cup is getting closer, then we'll see other perhaps reforms or changes taking place. So that's my hope.
Yeah. So, Josie, where can people find you and find your work?
Yeah, so they could go to, let me just make sure, atlanticcouncil.org/expert/Josie, Joze -Pelayo, Pelayo -. So you can go find my profile and then find the article if you'd like to read it.
Brilliant. And are you on social media that people could find you?
I am on social media, yes. So also my Twitter, handle, I don't know about memory.
You're not the only one. I can never remember my Twitter handle either.
My Twitter handle is Joze, Joze, then Mr as Mr, then Pelayo, Pelayo.
Brilliant. Well, I'm sure a lot of our listeners will go and check you out and hopefully reach out to you. And I have no doubt you were really receptive to engaging with us, and I'm sure you'll be really receptive to engaging with anyone there around this. And as always, to you guys who are not subscribers yet, what are you waiting for? There are so many fantastic podcasts and great content out there on Anfield Index Pro. So please do sign up and keep supporting. Even if you can't afford a monthly fee, just give a little share and a like to our podcasts. Okay, until next time, take care of yourselves.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this Anfield Index show. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel so future podcasts find their way to your device automatically. There's nothing quite like fan engagement, and we'd love to know what you think of anything discussed on this show. The best way to get in touch is over on our free Discord community, where both podcasters and listeners debate the hottest LFC topics 24/7. Sign up free now at AnfieldIndex.com/Discord. You won't regret it. You can also follow us on Twitter at Anfield Index and find us on Facebook by searching for Anfield Index. Oh, and before you go, we'd love it if you could leave us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app. It only takes a couple of seconds, and it means the world to the people who create these free shows.